Empieza tú una palabra de traducción. No, hay traducción.
I was practicing and I it was easy for English, but I just want to welcome everyone and thank everyone for joining us. Particularly, thank you, Team Groser, for being with us today and having this reflection, and to Alejandro Jara, who made possible this day. So welcome, everybody. Thank you very much. Alejandro is going to be in charge of the event today.
Thank you. I feel very honored to be in charge of something. Well, welcome. Thank you very much, Dorothea, for your hospitality. The Institute of International Relations, University of Chile, is a high prestige institute. Many decades studying international relations, many points of view, and both on economic and political, geopolitical viewpoints. So, welcome, Tim. Wonderful to have you here in Chile. Welcome to all the friends here and on the screen. Well, let me introduce Tim. Some of you know who he is, but others may not. Tim is an old hand in diplomacy with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade in New Zealand. He was the negotiator in the Uruguay round, 1986 to 94. He was in charge of agriculture. He was instrumental in bringing about the results of the Uruguay round on agriculture, which changed the landscape, I would say, of the multilateral trading system. He was also posted as ambassador to Indonesia from 94 to 97. Later on, he moved to be ambassador to the WTO, 2000, 2005. Then Tim left because I left as well. So I went across the street. I joined the secretary. Anyway, and as ambassador, he was in charge of, he was first chairing the negotiations on rules, and then moved on to, of course, agriculture once more, and did a very important job in there. Unfortunately, this round never finished. One day we hope it will somehow be part of, there will be some results, not of the round, some results in terms of improving the WTO. Then later became Minister of Trade. He joined politics and he was elected to Parliament. He held 3 ministries at the same time. There's really his capacity for work. Minister of Trade, of course, then Minister of Conservation, Minister for Climate Change negotiations. And that was 2010, 2015, if my notes are correct. He then moved out to become ambassador to the United States. Very important at the time, 2016, 2018. He was also, I should have started by saying he was born in Scotland. His parents were actors and he acted. He's still acting in more other ways than one, as a good diplomat always should. And he has done many things. Among other things he did, and I'd like to tell him about the story later.
Well, I got to censor it first of all.
Tell the story of the TPP, how it became possible, because he was the architect of it all. So, Tim, let me ask you first a question. What brings you to Chile?
Well, thank you very much, Alejandro. And thank you to all of you for coming here. I'm sorry that I learned French, not Spanish, as my second language, but that's life. I want to just acknowledge my colleague here, Andrew Malgani, who's with me. This is not the focus of the discussion. Just be aware that we're here to try and help your export industry by trying to set up a software company here that we think could make a big difference. So we handle in our country 50% of our exports. We have 550 clients in Australia and New Zealand, and we have a highly sophisticated technology that we think, particularly Chilean fresh produce, would benefit from. But that's the end of the commercial. I do also want to acknowledge my Australian colleague here, because everything we've done in the past 40 years has been sometimes a step ahead, sometimes a step behind. But with Australia, and the first trade negotiation I ever did, starting off as a Treasury representative in Canberra in the 70s, was the formation of our first ever real, I call them FTAs. When I use the term FTAs, I'm using it to encompass all these fancy titles of close economic partnership agreements, plurilaterals, all of which have arisen for political reasons, but it's just easier to call them FTAs. And the only thing I would say about the Australia-New Zealand FTA, which is, by the way, we held a contest amongst Australian and New Zealand officials. Alcohol was involved to find the most innocuous name we could think of for the FTA. And David Hawes, a legendary name in DFAT circles, but I'm suspecting well before your time, came up with closer economic relations. And we all laughed at David. Oh, come on. How could we adopt such a stupid name? It doesn't mean anything at all. And then we realized it's sheer genius. That's exactly what we need to fool the New Zealand public, which was terrified of free trade with Australia. Small divertissement. But it's a reminder of how we need to manage politically with some real skill this trade debate. And I've just come out with a very interesting conversation with one of your undersecretaries discussing the political management issues on the center-left of Chilean politics on this exact issue, which is very similar to managing center-left politics on trade in my country. And it's very important this is done with some sensitivity and with some skill. I assume that you would not be in this room if you were not broadly in the same school as Alejandro and I, which is believing we need a rules-based system, and that New Zealand and Chile, as relatively modest economies, Chile obviously rather larger, absolutely need this system to survive what is really the greatest threat to it since the end of the war. I also want to acknowledge a long-standing relationship that I have with Chile on this. As I said to your Undersecretary, the Chile-New Zealand relationship is not so important in terms of bilateral trade. We have very little bilateral trade going on between us. But it has been very important strategically over the years because our two countries face a very similar world. There are differences because of our geographic and cultural differences. But essentially, we face the need to work on smart strategy to provide a future for our countries. And New Zealand and Chile really do have a very strong track record of working, usually at senior official level rather than political level, I think. I still, although I did join the dark side and went into politics, I still feel much more comfortable describing myself as a technocrat than as a politician. So, I remember the first conversation I had with you, Alejandro. I'd known you a long time before this, and Ricardo Lagos, the son of the former president, and we're having dinner with him on Thursday, on trying to get Chile into TPP after I had started TPP with Singapore. And if anyone's interested in the underlying strategy behind the period, always the target was the United States. Always the target was the United States. I'm happy to divert onto that, but that would become more an economic history lesson addressing the current situation we face. So I'm very pleased to be here once again and reinforce that strategic relationship, because I think it serves both of our peoples pretty well. Behind all this, you know, I'm not an ideological free trader, come what may. I understand the politics have to be managed with some skill and some concessions to public opinion. And when free trade people go mad and lose touch with political reality in their domestic situations, they're not doing their countries a service. So I mean, I just had this very interesting conversation on ISDS with the Undersecretary. ISDS was a stupid idea. To say that is not to identify me as on the left of Chilean politics. It came out of, actually, the first ISDS treaty was written by West Germany, so it's before unification, with Pakistan to protect their investments. Because the West Germans realized they could not possibly depend on the integrity of the Pakistani legal system to defend investments in Pakistan. To apply that to American investments in Australia is ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. And I remember I reached agreement with the Australian Trade Minister, Andrew, what was Andrew's second name? I've forgotten his name, the Minister of Trade.
Ross.
Yeah, Andrew Ross, within one political nanosecond that we would not apply ISDS to either Australian investments in New Zealand or New Zealand investments in Australia. I'm simply using this to try to underline the importance of managing the politics of this well, because the politics of this have been managed unbelievably badly in the United States. And we need to remember that, because I don't think countries like us and many, many other countries that we are have very similar views, should reach the conclusion prematurely that we've lost the United States. I don't think that's either practical or necessarily correct. But they have gone down a dark road. And it's a road, no salida. It's going to lead nowhere for them. So, with those general comments, I'm not quite sure where you want to go, but I mean, I would open up immediately into the idea that I have put on the table in this little group of people that you invite me to join, the Friends of the Multilateral Group. But perhaps I'll just stop and...
No, please, carry on.
Okay. So, this is the biggest challenge to the rules-based system for 75 years. And a lot of people in this room know a lot about the history of this. For those of you who may have come from different academic specialities, let me just go through the ABCs. First of all, one of my favorite slightly conservative writers, an intellectual, Robert Kagan, pointed out in a brilliant book with a deeply disturbing, prescient title, written in 2018 when I was ambassador in Washington, called The Jungle Grows Back. The jungle representing the threat to a different world order ruled by rules. He famously said, and I'm quoting from memory, but it won't be wrong in any important respect, that when liberal principles, and the word liberal here is in the European, not the American sense of the word liberal, When liberal principles succeeded for the first time in world history of establishing a rules-based system after the Second World War, this was not because of our better angels, a phrase that's poetic and has a lot of meaning in American English, or the triumph of history. These ideas, Kagan said, had been around for centuries since the Enlightenment. They succeeded in 1945 because for the first time they had power behind them, the power of the United States. And let us not forget that in 1950, America had 50% of global GDP. The figure today is 23%. Now, this is not a history lesson, but a way of reminding us all the essentials that we owe the United States for all our anger at what is going on. We owe them a huge debt of gratitude. They could so easily have done what Trump is doing today. I have all the cards. I have all the cards. You just have to agree to this. So they could have done this with much greater force in 1945, and they chose to set up a system of rules. Now, did it have flaws designed to protect specific American interests? Of course it did. And one of those principal flaws is the reason why New Zealand, Chile, Australia, and others have worked since the formation of the Cairns Group and then in later iterations to try and address one of those principal flaws, which was, no, we can't have free trade in agriculture. So for the technically minded people, I'm referring to Article 11.2c and Article 16.4 and the exceptions for measures that are completely inconsistent. And they did this because the cotton, sugar, and dairy industries of the United States said, we can't live with this. So they tried to have, I don't know whether this phrase exists in Spanish, your cake and eat it too. What's that in Spanish?
I wouldn't.
Wouldn't attempt it. Okay, we're not addicted. And then the Americans spent 6 decades regretting that departure from principle until we essentially solved the problem in the Uruguay round and got operationally effective rules on agriculture. So I'm not whitewashing the Americans, but I'm giving them what I think is absolutely a high degree of credit for very far-sighted leadership when they had a position after the war to do something very different, and actually pretty much the script out of the White House today. I don't for a minute believe that we can take this threat lightly, but nor do I believe, as I foreshadowed in my first commentary, that we should, in a sense, give up on the United States. It is a foolish statement to say that. But I think we've got to take a very long-term view of this. Now, the most positive thing one can say about the situation is that the rest of the world has decided so far not to follow the United States down this political sewer. Sorry about the metaphor. If we were eating food, I would find another metaphor. And that is something very positive. I still think there is a danger of some slippage, which I'll come to when I come to the issue of the proposal of a standstill commitment. But I don't think it's a large danger. I think the European Union, as the single most important entity in the developed world beyond the United States, could be sitting around this table agreeing with every word I'm saying, actually. So from this point d'appui, from this central point, I think we've got to make a more conscious effort to defend the relatively open world trading system. So I always say I've never had an original idea in my life. I just steal other people's ideas. So I have no idea who I stole this from. But I proposed 3 or 4 months ago that we should have a conscious meeting of the 39 countries of the European Union and TPP. I refuse to call it the El Acuerdo de Asociación Transpacífico Integral y Progresista, but I call it TPP. We should have a meeting at a political level. And I have an agenda in my mind of points which I'll come to. Now, when I made that, when I did this long interview with this group of deep specialists that nobody out in the real world listens to, big friends of multilateral group, I did not anticipate that President of the European Commission, President Ursula von der Leyen, would pick this idea up about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And it was then strongly endorsed by the most important politician outside the Commission in Europe, the German Chancellor, who, I don't know about you people, and there may be some German experts around this table, my instinct tells me this guy is a truly important political leader, and we will find that out in the next few years. I deeply believe that, but it's more intuition than the knowledge of Germany that leads me to that view. And so she has called for this, but there's been dead silence since then. Now, the particular version of this that I've put on the table at the intellectual level amongst these trade experts, I think would be a reasonable and acceptable way of describing it, has got 4 different
Trade junkies.
Trade junkies. He's got 4 elements to it. The first element is simply the political act of a meeting, which I would overwhelmingly say should take place in Canada because of its greater political impact of being across the border. And that would be, according to my suggestion, a meeting of trade ministers with this guy. You could not invent a better Prime Minister of Canada right now on central casting than Mark Carney. I mean, everything about this guy, from his physical looks through to his CV, through to his serious face and his brilliant mind, he is the perfect Prime Minister of Canada. We should use him. So he would be the perfect master of ceremonies for my meeting. I couldn't stay for the whole meeting, but his trade minister would take over as the chair. We'd have four things to look at. The first thing is just to hold the meeting would be a massive political signal across the border to our American friends. By the way, when I first made this proposal to Ambassador John Weeks, somebody that I know a few other people around the table know very well, in an hour-long interview with me, I made the point that according to the polls, 60% of Americans disagree with Trump's policies. Now, I don't mean to be an intellectual snob in saying this, but we all know that that's at a very high level of understanding of what the issues is. Of course it is, any more than if we had an expert on health policy come to this table. None of us are health experts. We would only have a very broad idea about health policy. So I'm not making fun of Americans when I say this, but they would have only this highly general idea in their mind about trade. But 60%, according to all the polls, are opposed to what Trump is doing. And they haven't yet seen the downside in their hip pocket. Don't forget that. And the other thing, on speaking to my long-term, less pessimistic, I'm not going to say optimistic, view of Americans on trade, is derived from one of my closest American trade expert friends, Professor Doug Ober, who wrote this well, a number of books, but the magisterial book on US trade, called Clashing Over Commerce, about 4 or 5 years ago. And Doug, who frequently comes to New Zealand and goes eventually to read, the central finding in his magisterial book of the history of US trade is that there is never an inbuilt permanent majority in the United States in favor of trade. It has to be built brick by political brick. I hope my English is everyone okay? I'm quite experienced in speaking to English people who are excellent English speakers, but it's not their mother tongue. So, bearing in mind Doug's point, what was the last time we could test in the real world, where real money is being put on the table, America's preferences for trade? Well, it was in 2019 during Trump's first presidency, when you will recall, he got up and said, the NAFTA agreement is the worst trade agreement the world has ever seen. Goes back into his little bunker for a month or two, and reluctantly says, okay, so I've asked some of our people to see if we might be able to do something with it. And out comes USMCA, or as Scott Miller and who's the other trade guy?
Bill?
Yeah, call it. Your knowledge of English slang now needs to be very high level to understand the joke. You smacker. Sorry, I won't explain. And then he declares USMCA is the best ever trade agreement in the world it's ever seen. When I talked to Wendy Cutler and other experts that the two of us know intimately well, they will tell you 85% is the same as the NAFTA, the worst ever trade agreement. 10% is actually an improvement because the original NAFTA negotiated in the 1990s was out of date with technology. So this was good. And maybe 5% of USMCA is a mild backward movement, particularly on the rules of origin for auto trade. But overall, you'd say, well, that's fine. So the question here, and this is getting to my key political point about let us not be too pessimistic about the longer term outlook, is that when it went to the House of Reps for a vote, from memory, it passed 454 members, 454 members of the House of Representatives. It passed by something like 350 to 35 against. In other words, you would have had to invent a resolution that would say America likes motherhood and apple pie to get as large a majority in favor as the last trade agreement put before the US Congress. Now, I'm not trying to make like things have gone bad since then, and they're getting worse. So I'm not trying to make light of our problem with the Democrats. I'm just trying to say, be very patient, because the history of the United States on trade, take Doug Irwin's point, shows there is never an inbuilt permanent majority in favor of open trade policies. The support has to be built political brick by political brick. Now go back to this high level idea. If we could get our 39 governments to agree to such a meeting, and I think this is utterly achievable, if the President of the Commission and this leader of the most important European country has said yes, this is achievable. And the TPP countries are halfway there already on the basis of the communique from Seoul in May, which talked about a closer dialogue with two groupings, the European Union and the ASEAN countries. So the foot is more than in the door here, okay? The very fact of the meeting itself is it would be a major political signal, because you can guarantee, if we could pull it off, what the op-eds in the Wall Street Journal would be saying. Why the hell are we not there? These are all our traditional friends. Why the hell are we not there, Mr. President, is what the op-eds would say. So I can't recall which genius said half of life is just about turning up. But that's the first one. Just turning up for that meeting is itself a major political initiative. The second item I'm suggesting is, again, recall my phrase, I've never had an original idea in my mind. I've stolen something we did in the Uruguay round at the beginning of it. Stand still. So I was chosen at a very young age to be our chief negotiator, and I participated in that negotiation of the Uruguay round standard agreement. It was among the easiest negotiations I've ever participated in, because who can at the end of the day object to a statement that says, we've already taken these commitments on trade, not to do this, not to do that, let's reaffirm those commitments. This is not hard, ladies and gentlemen. Okay? But it's designed, if you're a deep pessimist, and I'm not, you've got the Hawley Smoot memory in your mind, in which Hawley, the Democrat and the Republican, Hawley Smoot, I think, by the way, that if any of you are doubting whether God exists, you should abandon that doubt right now. But you should add, yes, God clearly exists, but he has a wicked, negative sense of humor. Because the spokesperson for protectionism now is Senator Josh Hawley, same name, Hawley Smoot, which I think proves God has a wicked, negative sense of humor. So what we're worried about is the spread of protectionism beyond the United States. Now, I personally don't think this is strong. Please recall my opening statement. I see no evidence that the other major economies want to follow the United States down this perilous protectionist path. But I am aware that figures on the extreme right in Europe are saying things about, let us at least protect Europe. And it's mixed in, frankly, with a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment. So I don't completely dismiss this. Why on earth would our governments not want to do something terribly simple to provide a little bit of a defense against this? Because none of the trade ministers in any of those 39 countries were around with me when we established the commitments in the Uruguay round, on which 80% of global commerce still rests, right? It's something as high as 80%. There's no FTA between European Union and the United States. Some 80% for all the failings of the WTO still rest on those commitments, or the acquis, as the French negotiators call it, of the Uruguay round. So, I mean, I've already drafted it, by the way, and I hope that somebody wants to see it. And it's stolen from the Uruguay round. For those of you who are more technically minded, but I'm not going to explain it because it's unnecessary, it of course includes carve-outs for Article 6, Article 16, Article 20, Article 21 exceptions. In other words, you can invoke anti-dumping, CDD, etc., to protect you against unfair competition. That is politically essential for all countries. I'm happy to elaborate for people who are not unfortunate people like Alejandro and have never had to deal with these technical issues. So in other words, it's a commitment to maintain the open economy, but with all the protections for unfair trade built into that political commitment, as in the classical Uruguay round. Stand still. The third and fourth agenda items I've called my sweet and sour dish. Now, the sour dish is obviously around the issue of either the actuality or the threat of retaliation against the United States. Now, Chile and New Zealand and Australia are not going to retaliate against the United States in Australia. And as I've said in public comments in New Zealand, I apologize for the gender-specific nature of my analogy. As a little boy at the age of 6, you learn in the playground very quickly not to pick fights with bigger boys. It's as simple as that. Okay? I mean, you still have fights, but let's have 2 6-year-olds against each other. So we're not going to do retaliation. But we have to accept that Canada, the European Union, at least, have certainly maintained the threat thereof. Whether they ever do it, on va voir, we'll see. So that's the sour agenda item, and the Chilean and New Zealand delegations will sit there quietly during that part of agenda item 3. But there has to be a sweet dish to accompany the sour dish, and this is, in my personal conception of the proposal, the most important, which is we do hear the United States. There are systemic long-term issues and problems in the international trading system. The WTO, I've described in a number of articles I've written internationally, has shown it's capable only of taking baby steps at a glacial pace, in spite of efforts from all manner of people, some of whom are around this table today. But it hasn't worked to keep the process moving. And I've often returned to an old cliche of the late 80s when we were worried about the gap, as it then was, and in the middle of a Uruguay round, which was itself going round in circles. There was a very powerful metaphor which has got out of fashion, and it needs to be brought back into currency, called the bicycle theory of international trade. And the metaphor was this: the bicycle, when it comes up to the lights and they are red, it can't stay for long in one spot. The bicycle must either move forward or it will slip backwards. Now, trying to make jokes about this, I used to say, but there are many trick cyclists in Geneva who can keep pushing the handlebars with the pedals and doing clever maneuvers to keep it in place for a long time. And they did. But by about 2012, they were exhausted. And the bicycle has slipped backwards. There's no doubt about that. Okay? So we need to find a way of shifting direction. We need to start trying to map out a way that the bicycle can move forward and regain a little bit of momentum again. And the first step in that, I think, ladies and gentlemen, is start the very first basis of defining an agenda. And I'm guided by this, by memories of unquestionably the best negotiator I ever saw, except for Alejandro, of course. A brilliant man, Warren Laverell, that you would have known deeply well, and the most outstanding American. He was also ended up as Deputy Director General, like you. When we were trying to build support for the Uruguay round, Warren started off with just this, just a notebook. All right, Chile, what are the issues that worry you about the current system? And the Chilean ambassador would start up. All right, New Zealand, what are your concerns? In other words, you start to define what you think might become a negotiation in a very simple way. And after 30 years of stasis, after 30 years of very little happening in Geneva of substance, we need to start from that principle. So what have we got, Madam EU? Well, we've got massive overinvestment in China in the auto sector. In other words, you start to define an agenda of change. And there is I'll stop now, but I'll give you a little personal anecdote of how we solved the problem for the launch in Punta del Este. So what had happened in 1986 was this process that this brilliant American had started broke down in the formal process in the Centre William Rapin. And the EFTA countries, the European Free Trade Agreement, those countries were much more powerful in 1986 than they are today because they included Sweden, Norway, Switzerland, Iceland, and Finland. Liechtenstein. And they had some exceptionally talented people as chief negotiators. And what happened is that two brilliant but deeply malignant ambassadors had screwed up the system under Arthur Dunkel in Room C. Batista from Brazil and Ambassador Shuka from India. I'm not necessarily blaming them as individuals. They were probably adequately representing the deep anti-trade views of their governments accurately. Most of us around, or no, in fact, some of us around this table have been for many years professional diplomats. We get it. You must represent the views of your government. They did it brilliantly, but at the risk of destroying the entire system, because neither Brazil nor India cared in those days about the system. So the EFTA building started to write up a declaration, a mandate. But when it came to agriculture, they had a blank page. So they approached me. I won't elaborate in front of an Australian why. And I went into the EFTA building with my junior colleague, Crawford Faulkner, now Sir Crawford Faulkner, who ended up as Britain's chief trade negotiator after 30 years of fighting with me in New Zealand. And we negotiated the basis of the Punta del Este Declaration. And what happened was very intriguing from a human and a political perspective. Slowly, other people started to drift into the room, including Chile, including Colombia, and most importantly of all, including Paul Tran, the famous European Union ambassador, a close friend of mine. I hope he's still alive. He's about 95. And Paul comes up to me. I'm 35 years old. And he pokes me in the chest with his finger. I'm hardly a large guy. He comes up to about here on me. And he pokes me in the chest and says, "You, New Zealand," in his broken English, "you count for nothing. But my real negotiating partner, the United States, is not in this room. So even though New Zealand is irrelevant, I will negotiate the agriculture text with you, and I will do it with integrity," which he did. So Paul and I wrote 9/10 of the mandate for the Uruguay round agriculture negotiation. And I'm keeping the Americans informed on the side. Through Warren, we would mysteriously meet. He was forbidden to enter the room. But we would mysteriously have regular coffees together. And that's the model I'm following in my mind. We have to have a political focus for it, which is now being endorsed by one of the most important people on the planet, President of the European Commission and the German Chancellor. We need to see leadership out of Japan after the Diet elections on the 20th of July. I've been in touch with some very senior Japanese people. We need to have a meeting. It needs to have, I'm suggesting, 4 elements to it. The meeting itself is the principal point of it. standstill commitment negotiated, a discussion of retaliation or threats of retaliation for the few people there that would want to talk about that. And then the fourth agenda item is a very high level, simple discussion along the lines that I've just outlined. So voila, that's my proposal.
Thank you very much, Sid. I'll let you rest for 30 seconds.
And you'll see, by the way, before you go, this shows you what a brilliant old hand I am from Geneva, because the trip in Geneva, which revolves around very elaborate lunches at Bermuda, is you make your intervention stop at the exact moment when they start serving the food.
Maria took many people in this table.
Yeah.
Well, we can ask questions and make comments now, but I'd like to kick off by observing the fact that in this setup, TPP plus EU, perhaps EFTA countries, the South Korea, I don't know, you have two very important players who are not included, that is India and China. I think I know the answers, but would you care to comment as to when they come into play or just come? For one thing, for example, if you include China in the very beginning, this will be seen by the White House as something be against the United States. And one has to be very careful about that.
It's dead if you invite China's into. And in fact, I would go further and say the room wouldn't happen because it would be politically impossible for Canada and Mexico to participate in such a meeting. On the level of, there's a very delicate issue here around the trade-off between allowing people who have every reason to be in a room and effectiveness. Even 39 countries is about 34 too many. I could give you so many practical examples of this from my life, especially from climate change, when I was asked by Patricia Espinosa, the brilliant foreign minister of Mexico, to pick up the pieces between China and the United States in 2010 in Cancun, after the collapse of Copenhagen, over a ridiculous proposal that the European Union had proposed for the global solution on climate change. You can't have too many people in a room. If you want to make progress, you've got to have a tiny number of people in the room. 39 is already far too many, okay? But it's necessary to start with that. And then you would need to establish a small number. You do not involve many countries with every right to be there because of the trade-off between efficacy and reasonableness. Efficacy trumps reasonableness every day of the diplomatic.
Thank you, Mario.
Thank you. Very interesting as usual. In the last meeting that we have in the FMG, you mentioned, I asked you if what would be in this idea of the 39 countries involved, the participation of the Secretariat, and you said
None.
Have you changed your mind?
No.
Why?
Because the same director general was.
For the same reason, Mario, at the end of the day, the Secretariat, the Director General would face an almost impossible question from some brilliant but malevolent ambassadors. You're the Secretary General, you're the Director General of the World Trade Organization. We were not invited. Why were you there? Are you pretending, Madame, that you speak for us? It's not possible. Now, sorry, this is the formal position. The informal position, it's behind the scenes. Selected members of us who know what we are talking about would be keeping the key Secretariat officials, including Director General, in touch with every single development that is going on. and asking for their own views and feedback. But they cannot come into this. We must go out of the building first. And this is why I think, Mario, the metaphor that I'm consciously following of the EFTA building process, which had Arthur Duncan never came into that. And I have great respect for the late Arthur, but he could not come into that. His process had utterly failed, and it was no fault of Arthur's that it had failed. This is the same situation.
Alicia?
Yes, well, thank you very much for your inspiring words. I like this idea of the coordination between the EU and the CPTPP. Brilliant. And actually, I think some of us heard it for the first time in the same room in a presentation by Arantxa González in early May, which was really very interesting. And however, there is, of course, the temptation, and it's actually occurring for countries, for CPTPP countries to go bilateral. And they're actually doing it. How do you see the risk? How do you perceive
You mean
it?
bilateral with the United States?
Yes.
This is the biggest problem in the proposal,
Uh-huh.
because the first responsibility of the, say, the Chilean government or the New Zealand government or the Australian government is to stabilize their relationship with the United States. That's much more important than what I'm talking about. So this has to be quite explicit that this is sitting parallel to every individual country's efforts to stabilize their bilateral trade and investment relationship with the United States. There's absolutely essential to have this understanding. Now, I see two reactions likely to that statement. The first reaction will be a real constraint. We haven't got time to worry about the future. And in the meeting I had with your Undersecretary this morning, I used an old metaphor from American slang that I think your English is powerful enough to understand. When you pass by a person struggling with an alligator in the swamp, it is not the right thing to say, you should have drained the swamp last summer. That will be deeply presented. First, they have to struggle with the alligator, and that's what we do. I personally have the view that we should be able to do both at once. And I would go further and say that the vague political signal of a meeting taking place of 39 of the closest allies and partners of the United States in Canada would actually reinforce the struggle with the alligator, the struggle to survive, the struggle to stabilize each of our countries' trade and investment relationships. It would have no effect on Pete Navarro, okay? I mean, they don't give a damn about the rest of the world. But they're not the only people there. You've got political adults like Scott in the room. I mean, I'm actually quite close to a few people in the Trump administration. I was invited up for 10 days before the president's inauguration by one of the key Trump organizations because of my close links with them when I was ambassador. I can't understand what their administration's doing. So my view is you have this meeting, it'll send out signals that the president won't even be aware of. He won't care a damn about a meeting. He'll pass off to CNN with a comment like, oh, well, some irrelevant meeting going on, aren't we? Okay. Have to do that, still got to deal with us. That'll be his reaction. But it's a little more than that. It's more to the United States in the long term. This will take time. And to return to the model that I'm following in my mind, the way in which we put the Punta del Este Declaration, the mandate for the last successful Uruguay round together, outside the GATT building. Eventually, the Americans did turn up. When they got to Punta, by the way, the French rejected the compromise that we negotiated outside the GATT building. But Paul Tran, who negotiated personally largely with me, very carefully maintained marche de manœuvre inside the system. And when they got to Punta with this insane American idea of smashing heads at a political level, which of course produces nothing, somebody had a brilliant idea. Let's go back and have a look at what these guys in Geneva did. They changed 3 words to it and declared victory. This is the model that I'm following.
Okay, by the way, our friends on the screen can also ask questions. And I recognize Mr. Elvio Rosselli. Following from you.
No, my God.
Yes.
If I'd known Elvia was there, I'd never have agreed to this luncheon.
Y open the camera. I don't know if you can.
Carlos, there you go.
¿Puede abrir el micrófono?
No sé.
Sí, apagó la cámara, no sé si quería preguntar.
Es que apagó su cámara. Sigue el a ver la mano.
Sí, le estoy pidiendo solicitar el audio.
Elvio?
Sí,
Escuchamos todo.
Okay, finally I was unmuted. And it's been a pleasure listening to the wise man from New Zealand who sent me on a trip to nostalgia for a few minutes, reminding us of the origins of the Uruguay round and the different instances we all shared. And I would say even today we evoke with pleasure. But I was particularly attracted to the ideas, where are we going now? Where are we going to, how to handle, how to manage this terrible situation we find all of ourselves in. And the idea that I heard Tim expose on this meeting of like-minded countries and eventually personalities to serve as bridges to build alternatives for the future sounds the right thing to do. I mean, number one, let us not follow the same route the United States taking. The problem is that some of the larger trading partners feel compelled to negotiate bilateral with the United States because the stakes are very, very high. Those of us who are more on the periphery and are not significant trading partners can claim honorably our adherence to principle and not do much. But the problem is that if we all take the same attitude, we will not get anywhere. So there will be a lot of, how can I say, need to play both games at the same time. trying to minimize the damage currently being inflicted upon the world economy and preparing for brighter days, because there will be brighter days. This administration will be over one day, and it will be necessary to pick up the pieces. And some of us might not be there when that happens, but it will be important to remember that there is indeed a great deal of things to be done as of today. And I finalize here my remarks and let you enjoy what looks like a very appetizing lunch. And not to mention the quality of Chilean wines that I love. Great seeing you, Tim and Alejandro, and I know Mario is around there, although I don't see him. And say hello to everybody else.
For those present, I'd like to say that Elvio is Uruguayan, he's one of the most brilliant diplomats.
Absolutely.
And trade negotiator in Uruguay, and they're good friend from way back.
But I did have one advantage. His boss, Julio Alacate, who I know LBO will be agreeing with me as I say this, was one of the great figures of the post-war international trading system.
Right. Just like to make a remark with regards to your brighter day to come or will come. We said the same thing during the Trump's first administration. But as it turned out, the next administration, the President Biden, did not roll back most of the measures that were adopted by the Trump administration. I don't know what's going to happen in 3 years down the road when they're changing the government in the United States. I think we'll have to see about also the economic results, how it's going to impact the population. Therefore, where the American public will make politicians change things or not. I don't know. Your views on that.
Well, my views are that the old Bill Clinton cliche is the clue to it. The old Bill Clinton cliche is, it's the economy that's stupid. A phrase he used in 1990 or thereabouts to say what drives politics in the United States. So the way this will be resolved is on the streets of the United States, not through the courts, not through op-eds in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, but what happens to American standard of living. And if they have to pay 50% tariff on copper, and everything made out of copper starts to increase by 5% or whatever, I tell you, it's not going to go well. So we've seen this in the upsurge of inflation, how quickly politics can change when the pocketbook is hurt. So that's how it will be. Now, I don't think we should waste time trying to look through the forecasts for the US economy. I mean, broadly, all the private sector and public sector forecasts are for a drop of at least 1 percentile point in the GDP this year, real GDP this year, and some are a little bit more. I don't think, looking back at it, you can say it's a disaster, but not going to look all that pretty next year. This will take time to feed through into any understanding of the system. I think we should assume that there will be no response from the Americans to, if we were to do something along the lines that several people, including now me, are saying, don't expect any reaction from the United States. It's the right response. We just get on with business and mind our own business while doing everything we can individually to stabilize our relationship with the United States. In the belief that we slowly change, as practical experience shows, this is taking you nowhere. I mean, let's just use copper as an example. Here's the data that I understand. Some of you will know this far better than me. 60% of all copper consumed in the United States is imported. Chile is the #1 source of imports. It takes, on average, 10 years to build a copper mine, a large copper mine. In the Wall Street Journal 3 days ago, it came up a figure I think is a deliberate exaggeration. They said that the average copper mine in the United States takes 29 years to establish. There is then a 3-year period from the extraction of the first concentrate. You see, my brilliant research assistant is called Senora Grok, which is my favorite. I prefer it to Senora Chat GPT. So he's done all this research for me. It takes another 3 years, and it then takes 10 years on average to return the investment before you make a dollar. So if you want to invest your dollar in your retirement on a US copper mine, you've got to be confident of one thing, that there will be continued political support for 50% tariffs imposed on copper for the next 35 years. Otherwise, you're going to lose your money. You can see, ladies and gentlemen, it's not going to happen. But it may take some real time for these sophisticated lessons of history. And there's a very famous quote from none other than Alexander Hamilton on this, which I'll translate into modern English because the old English is challenging. Experienced, Alexander Hamilton said, experience is a very brutal school, but it is the only school that fools attend. I hope that's self-evident what he's saying. I've used in my speeches in New Zealand a different metaphor, which you've heard, Ben, John, which is most of us learn from our mothers at the age of 3. Don't put your hand on the stove, it will burn you and you will hurt. And none of us around this table, we may have accidentally touched a hot element on an oven, but none of us have thought, I wonder if our mother's right. I've got to try this for myself. No. None of us have done this, but some people just have to put their hand on the stove.
I'll tell you how Mario taught his kids. Mario told his kids, turn on the oven and say, come here, put your hand. No words.
This could take some time, ladies and gentlemen. Yes. This could take some long time. So we stabilize, this is my formula. Chile, Australia, New Zealand, 3 countries represented around this table. Stabilize your relationships individually. Make whatever goddamn compromise you have to try and avoid things getting worse for your people. In the meantime, group with us. We're not following the US, but we need to do something positive. Where that goes, on verra, we will see. But it can't possibly do any damage, and it might do some good.
Mario?
Sorry for asking for second time, but regarding your experience, and I know you, what's your view about the BRICS, vis-a-vis this idea of 80% of the world or 39 countries organizing an alternative to the WTO practice for the time being in the mean.
Sorry.
I know that you're not proposing an alternative, but that will be the reality because on the one hand, we have people that are saying the WTO without the US. Others in the US are saying the US without the WTO. Tranquility, which is putting aside Brazil, putting aside India, putting aside the BRICS, China. So there's attention there. Of course, for the time being, the BRICS is not important. However, the relative importance of BRICS may change depending the reality of the reaction rather. This is implemented. How Brazil will react? Will say we'll negotiate or will say we will impose, we will retaliate the US. This will generate a sort of friendship or will increase the the group, the power, relative power of this BRICS group?
Well, first of all, BRICS, the 80% of the GDP of BRICS is China. So should be seen as a Chinese foreign policy. It's not a trade policy. The idea of BRICS developing a formal trade policy framework out of this seems to me to be near zero. It's my brutal personal opinion. Now, I think for Chile, it's more complicated than for Australia and New Zealand, because absurdly, though you call yourself still a member of the developing world, it's utterly absurd, by the way. You have got some politics that you need to manage that Australia and New Zealand do not need to manage in terms of your membership of the South. So if I were a Chilean politician or senior official, I'd be taking a slightly different position to what I would as a New Zealander. So you manage that, but it's about international politics. It's not about trade. I'm sorry. That's my view. I mean, I think the whole agreement is such an artificial thing because, you know, you've got this India and China, the two most important parts of it, have fought 3 border wars since the war. Brazil, yeah, has got a tremendously strong interest in selling coal and iron ore to China. So if I were a Brazilian, I'd be doing exactly what they are doing. It's very sensitive on the part of the Brazilians to do what they're doing. But this is not an alternative drawings-based system and never will become one.
First of all, thank you to Dorothea and Alejandro for this invitation, for the Institute for hosting us and offering this wonderful meal. Thank you, Mr. Tim Groser, for your speech. Very insightful, very thoughtful as well. My question would be more regarding to China, because this work cannot be seen only from the US perspective, and this EU plus CPTPP group, which in the CPTPP language we call it a dialogue, which was announced, as you mentioned, last May. Left to be seen how this will evolve in the future. Right? The framework is not yet quite defined, but there is some sort of hope that we can come up with something important in the future. But what's going on with China? Because of course China today is trying to have a leadership in the global order, and particularly in the multilateral trading system. So how we can manage this creation of new multilateral trading order without considering China's views, because we have not yet seen China upset, we have only seen the US. So this is a very, very delicate balance, in my view, how we can manage the US and China at the same time.
Well, I have very, very strong views on this subject, and they start from an unconventional point of view, given that I'm a white European person. But I have enormous respect for the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, and I have very good reason for saying it. They are extremely sophisticated people. Now, if I were the chef of this soi-disant negotiation or discussion of the 39 countries, I would engage immediately in deep discussions and conversations with both the United States and with China at the same time. I think in the United States, you would be met with some officials would say, we don't care. That would be the president, internal White House. Whatever you like, you're irrelevant. That will be the American response. Chinese response will be much more subtle. And I've already had a partial response, but I prefer to keep it private. I think many of them inside the Ministry of Commerce of China, I think the foreign ministry is more complicated because they see it in terms of what I call crudely UN politics rather than WTO politics. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce, I would predict, would say, let's see how this evolves. They wouldn't take a negative view. They wouldn't take a positive view of it either. They would take a detached view of it. And they would know that they have a lot of leverage over Australia, New Zealand, Chile, the three countries around there, because it's all of our number one export market. I'd even go so far as to say there will be some in the Chinese system who say probably this is quite positive actually. Well, let's see where this will go. We China don't need to do anything about this. This is where I think the Chinese will come out. That's my view. But you cannot invite China into this. Nor, although, you know, it took me, because of the negotiating origins of TPP, which New Zealand started with Singapore, then Chile came. I was the administrator of the agreement. I mean, so technically, during the TPP negotiations, 2010 to 2015, New Zealand was in charge of it. But this is a political fiction, because when we would have meetings at head of government level, my prime minister would immediately pass to Obama to take over. So it was a political fiction that New Zealand was the head of TPP, obviously. But I used to have quiet discussions with Wong Shi-Wen, who's now no longer the key negotiator for the Ministry of Commerce, which were incredibly interesting and friendly. He was making it clear to me, because he knew me from way back when I was a respectable person, i.e. an official, that we were not anti-China. He knew that. And it was clear to me the Ministry of Commerce wanted to join the TPP negotiations way back in 2013, 2014. And I would be briefing Mike Froman all the time on my discussions with China. And at first, Mike didn't believe me, but I remember one celebrated dinner I had with Mike. Mike Froman, for those of you who don't know him, was originally the president's Undersecretary for International Economic Affairs in the White House and then replaced Ron Kirk as USTR. So he said to me, you know, you're right, they want to join. I said, so what's your position? He said, let's complete this deal first, which I thought was a very, very sensible US response. And on many occasions, I used to make fun of Mike because I was having, as the Australian negotiators were, an argument with him on certain provisions that were being negotiated in TPP. And I said to him, I'll bet you would be taking a very different position if China were involved in this negotiation, to which his response was just to laugh. So, I mean, we were still following then a plot that is no longer feasible, which was the whole globalization plot. Bring the Russians into the WTO. Bring the Chinese into the WTO. This is the Western-based rule system. That was the plot that the United States was following. And countries like the three countries represented around this table were also following, because we take ultimately some respect for power. And we needed to stay within the framework of US policy. That plot is no longer exists. But that was the plot so China joining TPP, if the Americans had lost confidence completely in trade, would not have been financially positive in a longer term phase beyond bedding down TPP with the Americans involved. But to advocate China being in TPP now without the Americans is a completely different political proposition that even I would be opposed to. I love the Chinese. I get on extremely well with them. I managed to persuade Wang Yi to allow me to negotiate a comprehensive FTA with Taiwan. We can't get more sensitive than that. But it's not the right time and place to do this now. And it would be literally impossible for Mexico and Canada, given their dependence on the American market. They would walk out of TPP the moment you let China through the firewall.
Which role have the competitivity of the US economy in this program?
Sorry, I don't quite understand the question.
I think that maybe the efficiency of the economy of US, of production in US, is the role of this program that you have today of protection.
Well, you're right in terms of the normal progression of economic change inside the United States. And this is something that is not recognized by the Pete Navarro School of Trade Economics. Of course, the United States is not competitive with Bangladesh in terms of producing bedding sheets for hotels. But the United States is massively competitive in other areas of international commerce. And that we have to come back to the most basic Eco 101 understanding of international economics and what Ricardo Hume told us 200 years ago. You can't be competitive in everything. It's called comparative, not absolute advantage. But let's not convert this into an undergraduate course in economics. But it is the root, political root of this concern. And when I look at, you know, the pictures of Trump announcing these tariff increases in front of American auto workers, honestly, I weep for those working class Americans behind it in the photo. I weep for them. Do they not realize that by imposing a 50% tariff on steel, a 40% tariff on aluminium, and all of these other vital inputs into auto manufacturing, that this is going to put them out of a job? And the answer is no, they do not understand. And how could you expect to understand that? So these lessons will be bitterly learned over the years unless they change policy.
I'm so sorry for people asking. We're Chileans, we don't put a lot of questions in this kind of meeting. My question is regarding, you mentioned Mike Froman. He himself, this was 3 weeks ago, sort of in public, in Washington, he said that on his view, the MFN, it's dead. I think of the word he used.
Yeah.
I saw that.
Yeah.
I wondered when I read that, should I be shocked by it? Or should I interpret Mike's response to that question as factually correct statement? Because as I recall the precise word of the question, it was this. Do you agree that MFN, the foundation principle of non-discrimination in the international affairs system, is dead? And B, Mike, do you agree that nobody in the US seems to care about it? So you could argue, to be fair to Mike, that he was responding completely correctly to the questions. The answer to the first question, is it dead? Is clearly, yes, it is dead. And the answer to the second question is not literally true. Does nobody care about it? Because there is no doubt a number of people who are professors of economics care about it. The correct answer politically is no, nobody cares about it. I don't know, Mike is a complicated guy, so you never quite know with Mike where he stands on something.
You might say that that's never that as far as the United States is concerned, but for the rest of the world, largely it's still applicable.
That's exactly my point about when I said none of the other countries that follow the United States down the pathway. We have not abandoned.
Very good question. I understood what you present as a framework for the activity of these particular countries. But if they agree on an agenda for what? For trade among them, for reform of the WTO, because if they go to the WTO, well, they will have to negotiate with China, with Russia, with the United States. If the United States is being a member of the organization. So that's important because if they are trying to find an understanding among the 39 and perhaps allowing others to join, that will be one thing, but leading this agenda to the WTO will be another trend, or I'm wrong.
Well, we've had 30 years to allow that option. What did it give us? That's my answer. It's a brutal answer, but it would be the ultimate destination, in my view. Ultimately, you repatriate something from outside the WTO back into the WTO, but with all the weight of a deeper negotiation, which necessarily, in my view, for political reasons, has to start outside the door. It's as simple as that. Now, with respect to answering the question that you started your observations with, I'm claiming, perhaps wrongly, to be the creator of the phrase in the GATT, constructive ambiguity. And I did it after another reference to Paul Tran, this brilliant trade diplomat, in which he had, I knew exactly what he was doing in his speech, which was he didn't have a unified position for member states. So what he was doing was, in a very clever way, there are different member states that think this, some others think that, and some others think this again. And then somebody, I don't know what country, will blame it on the Americans, maybe the Americans got upset. He's all over the place. This is not coherent. And I put up my flag and said, no, you're wrong. This is constructive ambiguity. He's explaining the pressures on the, and I said this quite openly in the GATT meeting. Now, that phrase, I don't know whether it came from somewhere else. I just picked it up here. If you ask me, on the first part of your question, what should we do with these agreements? The right answer is constructive ambiguity. We should not answer that question now. Leave it deliberately ambiguous. Otherwise, you divert the political decisions down a track that people are not ready to proceed. Would, people ask, it's a question, don't ask the right questions at the wrong time. Right? I mean, think about your relationships when you were young with the opposite sex if you were heterosexual. Is it really sensible to ask all the questions right at the beginning? You can't answer that question.
An outsider. It's
Maria Teresa Infante, she is a formidable woman, it's the best student of law school.
As soon as she said, she's a question from an outsider, my alarm bells immediately.
I mean, so many friends, but it's a question because I work in the field of international law, a little bit of the law this year, so also we're trying to look at the situation in several settings. The Pacific, in the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic, and so the Southern, and so on. And there is this flow, your words, what I saw is the parallel between multilateralism in trade and economics, and then some other spheres, multilateralism. Unfortunately, that is a dilemma, because some people in Chile believe that we can do something in favor of multilateralism without looking at the real roots and the network that is supporting the multilateralism on the other side, economics and so on. So this is a bit of the dilemma with some of the members of the BRICS we have, where we have so many common ideas with some countries, but some of them are playing in a different world in the multilateral sphere, not only trade. How do you see this?
Well, this is a very deep question you can look at on a multi-layered basis. I mean, there's a huge issue behind this question as to whether really it was realistic to expand the gap from its essential base of industrialized countries with a few hangers-on into a UN of the international trading system, which you bring in because you see, as I see it, you're a professional lawyer, I'm not, but as I see law, it's a combination fundamentally of two different elements. One is what the letter of the law says, and the other is the strengths of the norms and informal understandings that lie around us. I mean, if you look at the source of the problem, technically, the Americans have looked at Article 21. I don't know whether you're a legal scholar, you know what I'm talking about, Article 21. This is for those of you who have not had the misfortune to have to worry about Article 21. It's the national security clause at the gap that is still the foundation stone of national security understandings in WTO. And what it says in plain English is, forget everything else in this agreement. You can do whatever you want if you think it's going to impede your national security. And I've always argued, by the way, Madame, that if I were a skeptical academic lawyer in 1947, and you had given me the text of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade to analyze, I would have said, throw it in the dustbin. It's ridiculous because of Article 21. And that, my mythical academic legal expert would have been wrong for 75 years, but he or she would have been right for the last 18 months. So there's a huge, almost really a philosophical issue here about whether converting the UN into the WTO into a UN of this trading system was the right thing to do. And if you'll permit me a luxury, I'll illustrate it with an anecdote. I come back as ambassador into Geneva in 2002. And I walk into a room where a very smart young woman, who's a member of my negotiating team, this is Emily Irwin, that name means anything to you, John. She's a professional lawyer, about 30 years old, and it's the accession of Myanmar to the WTO. And she is reading out a speech written for her in my capital that is palpably absurd. We, the New Zealand government, expect the Myanmar authorities to, and then a list of things on things like intellectual property, and I waited until she finished, and I took her out into the corridor above room E. And I said, Emily, why are you saying this? We don't have any trade with Myanmar. Okay. And only a month ago, a madman went into whatever is the royal palace in the capital city and massacred a third of the royal family with a machine gun. Meanwhile, there is a guerrilla warfare, people like Tupamaros, going on. They're called communists. But Emily, if you and I understood anything deeply about the culture of Burma, we might not describe them as communists. We might have an entirely different view of what this is like. They are not ready to adopt disciplines that a sophisticated country like Canada would have difficulty implementing. So your question raises this very deep question about whether there has been massive overreach here. Now, but on a simpler level, I would answer your question by saying we just have to try and move forward where we can. You know, let's not try and resolve these meaning of life questions right now, but hold to what we have, strengthen what we have, and I've made some suggestions about how to do that, and then wait and see what happens. Because I think to ask the right questions prematurely is a huge political mistake.
Thank you, Mr. Groser. I wanted to move you to the investment side. There is an emergent debate in Chile about the convenience of having a screening mechanism for investment in strategic sectors. I know that New Zealand, Australia already have this kind of mechanism, but I was wondering what is your opinion on the benefits, but also the cost of having this kind of mechanism?
My high-level view is it's essential to have a screening mechanism for political reasons. And it goes back to, my own philosophy on, there's a wonderful, I wonder whether there's a phrase for this in Spanish. It's a subtle phrase in English called, beware of doing too much good.
No,
you understand?
Absolutely.
Beware of doing too much good. In other words, the mad free traders who think we throw the whole textbook at everything. If it interferes with any economic efficiency or anything in the principles, we don't do that because we must be completely pure. They are fools. We need to make compromises with political reality. And the Chilean or New Zealand people will not accept foreign investment that has not gone through a screening mechanism. Now, having said that, that's the issue of principle. Then you have to design the screening mechanism. And that's more complicated. You don't want to put in a screening mechanism that is completely motivated by your political agenda to control foreign investment, so you can say to New Zealanders, don't worry, we've looked at this, we've had very expert officials who've looked at this, and it's all going to be terrific. If you take that too far, it becomes a massive disincentive to companies that say at the end of the day, we can do without Chile or New Zealand, honestly. Do you know that the last time we tried to invest in Chile, it took us 3 years, we spent $280,000 in legal. In other words, the design of my political safety valve is a very subtle and different question.
But at least know your part.
Very nice one. Well, that was
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Mr. In the business sector, there is some concern about this kind of mechanism because it would imply a political control of the investment. I just wanted to know if this kind of the debate was, did you have this kind of the debate in New Zealand?
Yes.
When you discuss this mechanism, especially this trade-off on implementing this.
Absolutely, we have the debate. And I'm not sure that you can ever resolve a debate like this finally. You have to make adjustments as the political climate goes. We know enough about the way the world works to know that generally speaking, the market economy is better than the planned economy. We all know that. But at various times in the history of the 3 countries around this table, we have experimented a little bit more with more state control, and at times a little more with pure free market. I mean, for God's sake, Chile itself is a perfect laboratory in terms of economic history. Look at that. And I don't think you can say this is ever settled once and for all. Thank you. It'll be interesting for you guys to see what the final score in Argentina is. I don't know how long we'll have to wait to know if there is a final score, but it's still far too early yet. But so far, so good. But only because they went completely overboard on the other direction.
You're responsible.
Absolutely, just outrageous. Outrageous. I honestly think the British investors. We're not wrong.
Except common sense. If I Hasta el año.
There's a very my killing masters, because I used to say first thing about revolution is
I wanted to know if
I'm only speaking for
you have
myself.
any resistance.
No, but I have presented this internationally via what I was referring to Alejandro said. And then I've written this up with the former chief negotiator of Canada, chief negotiator of the EU. I've written the reactions have been totally silent, which is quite interesting. And of course, since I started to talk about this, the president of the European Commission spoke and changes everyone. So I've been in touch with a certain person
that you were on the table. I know, but I'm you said wait until after the elections.
Todavía queda la negociación
Do I think we should watch?
He was wrong for 75 years.
I mean, if when you're saying like 45 so maybe we will.
I think that the thing that really interests me is the speed at which things are changing. So, you know, from the end of history. No, tomorrow. So this is. Oh, yes. Oh, no, wait a I'm not arguing the price. No, I'm here to say that if we are we don't want to. And this comes, by the way, back to I've been very deeply current views. Otherwise, he said, what you're saying is
Australia is just recently.
fulfilled obligations. The other team is not. He said, essentially what he said was, the evidence tells us pero
And personal experience.
Yeah.
And you know, in our bringing Well, there will be things if you come and ask the industry to